Welcome, dear listener. I'm Sebastian Nothwell, here today to give you an exclusive glimpse into the Oak King Holly King audiobook, narrated by Gary Furlong. If you're just tuning in, we're on the 5th chapter of a gay Victorian fae romance, and mortal clerk Wren Lofthouse has been dragged into a wild hunt by Shrike the Butcher of Blackthorn. Enjoy!
Chapter 5. It felt as if all three of them, Butcher, Wren, and the stag, had plunged off the edge of a cliff, not dashed against the earth, but falling through it. Wren had screwed his eyes shut in anticipation of the landing jolt. Cold wind struck his face like a crashing wave, and the shock of it forced his eyes open. The fog of London had vanished. The full moon hung overhead in a crisp night sky full to bursting with twinkling stars, framed by the dark green points of enormous pines looming all around them. Wren could see the colour truly, for the moon shone brighter than any gaslight, and it illuminated everything down to the lowest branches that still hung high above Wren's perch on the stag. Beneath these sat trunks wider than Wren was tall, surrounded by a carpet of ferns. The stag, mid-leap when Wren had opened his eyes, now landed delicately on its forehooves and trotted to a halt. "Where are we?" Wren whispered, his breath plumed in clouds of dragon smoke. He felt renewed gratitude for Butcher's cloak, warm and snug about his shoulders. Butcher turned to catch Wren's eye. He put his finger to his lips, then cupped his hand behind his ear. His pointed ear. In the moonlight and without his hood, Wren could see Butcher's ears quite clearly. Now there was no mistaking them for waxwork. He could see as well the black woolen tunic Butcher wore and how it clung to his muscular frame, tied off with a belted leather girdle at the waist and hanging down not much farther than that. Nothing covered Butcher's thighs save medieval hose, likewise black, and his black cavalier boots came up to his knees, a motley assortment of costuming eras in a monochromatic assembly. Wren shut his mouth but kept on staring in wide-eyed wonder at his new surroundings. He'd never seen so many stars in his life. Had seen none, in fact, since he'd moved to London. The silence was new to him as well. More so than the muffled angles of Staple Inn, the forest had no wagons rattling endlessly over cobblestones, no people shouting, no bells ringing, none of the millions of incidental human sounds that tumbled all on top of each other every minute in the city. Just the rustling of pine needles in the wind. Then he heard it, an eerie sound, a howl that began low and swooped upward to end in a triumphant blast that echoed throughout the forest as if from miles off. A hunting horn. Butcher took hold of the stag's antlers and dug his knees into its flanks. The stag leapt off once more, darting to and fro between the trees at harrowing speed, along no path Wren could perceive. He clung to Butcher's waist, his chest flush with Butcher's spine, the closest embrace he'd known in more years than he cared to count. The horn resounded again. In its wake, Wren heard the thunder of beating hooves rumbling ever nearer. He thought he glimpsed shadows between the pines, mounted riders as if their own reflection chased them. Then the stag burst through the trees and into the throng. A horde of hundreds surrounded them. Like leaping off a waterfall into flood-swollen torrents, the current of the pack swept up and swallowed the stag and its riders. Wren whirled his head round to glimpse them all, a grand host of elves in a staggering variety of costume, from Hellenic chitons to medieval armour. Garments of rough hide and blood-stained fur, Tudor velvets and slashed doublets, bark and bone. Some rode, some ran, and some seemed to fly. A raven-haired elf-maiden's tunic looked half iridescent feathers and half torn leaves, her face smeared blue with woad, and her white grin gleaming through it with wolfish fangs as she readied her twice-curved bow. Astride a grey horse rode a lady in a moon-white gown. Her hem trailed down past her steed's hooves, and it dragged through enough muck and gore to rend it into lacework tatters that flowed from white to pink to crimson black. Another rider in seafoam satin breeches and silk stockings would not have looked out of place in the court of George III, save for the spiderweb mask that obscured all but the knife-point tips of their blue ears. One hunter flitted along in a woolen cloak of mottled grey, storm cloud on the left side and moonlight on the right, with a thick fur ruff. Grey tresses fluttered in the wind behind them, though their smooth face bespoke youth. Wolfhounds bayed and darted between hooves and boots. No, Wren realized. Not just wolfhounds, but true wolves the size of horses, their long maws snapping the air and their thick fur rippling in the wind. The smaller and more wiry frames of the wolfhounds dashed about their larger friends with wagging tails. The crimson coat of a fox slipped amongst them, quick as a minnow in the overwhelming current. And some wolves. Wren blinked. But his vision remained unchanged, and so he felt forced to concede that some of the wolves had the shape of men, and leapt up on 2 legs to throw back their heads and howl. The werewolves were not the only hunters to straddle the worlds of men and beasts. Not every hoof belonged to a horse or hart. Merry fauns and sinister satyrs danced amidst the thundering hordes. Milk-white women with calf's ears and hollow backs ran on cloven hooves of gold. An immense broad-shouldered man with his blood-bay coat descending into iridescent black at his hands, hooves, horns, and the tip of his tufted whipcord tail, Wren knew in an instant for an incubus, though he had never before seen his like or encountered his description. And as Wren shot a second glance over his shoulder, he realized one figure he'd taken for a bearded archer on horseback was, in fact, a centaur. All this wild abandon worthy of Hieronymus Bosch paled in comparison to the leader of the pack. At the helm of the hunt, astride the largest and fiercest wolf, rode a man who would have stood 7 feet tall with both his heels on the ground. A pair of bear-skull pauldrons sat on his thick shoulders, while his grey beard, tinted green with moss, covered his thrice-broad chest like a pelt. Just as much hair trailed behind him, past his pointed ears and his antlers, which rivaled those of the stag Wren rode on even now. He gripped a cross-barbed spear in his right fist, and his left held a curling horn as long as a yardstick, from which he trumpeted the haunting howl that called the hunt to order. It occurred to Wren, as he regarded that barbed spear and the sundry implements of the other hunters, that he didn't carry a weapon, unless one counted the penknife in his waistcoat pocket, which Wren himself did not, and he doubted Butcher would either. And what, Wren wondered, but didn't dare ask aloud, was their prey? A guttural, gurgling shriek rent the air. Wren whipped his head towards the sound. A horrible, singular noise that echoed over the general cacophony of the wild hunt and seemed to come not from somewhere ahead of them, but from beside. Butcher's thighs clenched atop Wren's. The stag darted off to the left, away from the pack and deeper into the forest, towards the dreadful cry. Some other hunters seemed to have similar ideas, but the stag outstripped them all, darting nimbly through the dark, leaping over fallen logs and slipping under overhanging limbs. Wren, unable to see the path ahead, kept his narrow chest flush to Butcher's broad back, ducking when he ducked and dodging where he dodged. The hoots and horns of the hunt faded. Snapping twigs and rustling pine needles resounded in their stead. Then the babbling of running water, at first so faint that Wren assumed he imagined it, rose up louder and louder with every stride. Rapid tilts and plunges sent his heart into his throat and his stomach into knots. He tightened his arms around Butcher's lithe waist and tried to ignore how every leap brought his hips up against Butcher's backside. A sudden stop almost sent Wren sprawling from the stag's back. He clung to his perch and found himself on the edge of a riverbank. The forest broke away, allowing the moonlight to illuminate a sheer drop-off carved out by the water in its spring swells. Now, with the first frost well past, the mountain springs had frozen up, and the river they fed had dwindled to a mere stream that wound its way through the wood some 12 feet below the rim of its floodbank. Wren smelled the reason for the stag's halting before he saw it, the scent of wood smoke musk leaving him as he raised his head from the nape of Butcher's neck, replaced by a rank stench of stale urine, spoiled meat, and rotted blood. A glimpse down the steep bank into the riverbed destroyed any remaining doubt as to the source of the odour. There, in a curved hollow of frozen mud beside the river's bend, stood a boar. Until that moment, Wren had considered the wolves and steeds running in the wild hunt as the largest living creatures he'd ever seen. The boar dwarfed them. Indeed, it would have dwarfed any omnibus now rattling through London. A thick coat of stiff, wiry hair covered its mountainous bulk. Its natural colour Wren could not now discern. Its lower half had turned grey with brackish filth, and its enormous hump and head looked as if bathed in pitch. But for the stench, from which Wren felt forced to the sickening conclusion that the beast had wallowed in blood. Rivulets of fresher stuff spilled forth from its mouth between clusters of tusks, 3 to each side, the smallest as long as Wren's forearm, and the largest half as long as his entire body, with the leftmost one broken off at its tip and cracked down to its base in the festering gum-line. Deep furrows of black rot stained with blood-red rust ran through the yellow ivory. And as he gazed on the monstrosity, Wren knew little of that blood was its own. Butcher laid his hands on Wren's wrists and gently broke their embrace of his waist. Wren withdrew to give him freedom of movement. Butcher dismounted from the stag, a move which Wren thought foolish at best, until he realized they stood downwind of the horrible beast, and furthermore the sound of the rushing water, diminished as it might be, proved enough to cover the sound of Butcher's boots landing on the blanket of dried pine needles. "Stay mounted," he whispered to Wren. "The stag will bolt if the boar charges too near." Wren nodded. Though while he supposed the nimble stag would prove faster than the boar, he didn't feel entirely comfortable with leaving Butcher to his fate. As Butcher crept towards the edge of the tree line, Wren beheld his silhouette. Wrapping his cloak around Wren's shoulders had left him clothed in just tunic and hose. Belted around the waist, the tunic didn't fall far past Butcher's hips. At another time, Wren might have appreciated the view. At present, he fixated on the scabbards hanging on either side of Butcher's girdle. One held a dagger. The other appeared not quite so long as a sword and far more slender. Neither seemed an adequate weapon against a beast of such monstrous size. No sooner had Wren thought this than Butcher raised his arm into the lower reaches of the pine tree they sheltered beneath. Dead, its branches stretched out like skeletal fingers in the moonlight, and seized a stout limb. A single wrench broke it off in his fist. His dagger flashed out of its sheath, and within the minute he'd trimmed off all vestigial twigs and whittled a point onto his own makeshift spear. Then, silent as a shadow, he slipped off beyond Wren's sight. The boar, meanwhile, had pricked its ears at the echoing snap of the breaking branch and now snorted into the air, seeking the scent of what had made the sound. Its ploughshare trotters carved deep furrows into the mud as it spun round in its search. Its ears swiveled in all directions. Yet it seemed it could not perceive Butcher, much as Wren had lost him in the shadows beneath the trees. He held his breath and tangled his fists in the stag's thick mane as he waited. All at once the boar's nostrils flared. It reared, whirled, and charged the tree line with a guttural roar. Wren's heart leapt into his throat as he glimpsed a familiar silhouette darting behind the pines. The boar smashed into them a fraction of a second after. Wood cracked against tusks with a sound like cannon fire. The trees swayed. The stag shifted its stance beneath Wren, but did not bolt. Wren's gaze flitted across the tree line in a frantic search for any sign of Butcher. He'd almost given up hope when at last he spied him, limned in moonlight and crouching with makeshift spear in hand, a mere stone's throw in front of the boar. Only the tusks, caught on half-shattered trunks, prevented the boar from charging him. It yanked its head backwards with violence and tore up the ground with its trotters in its efforts to break free, but its initial blow had embedded itself deep with the trees, and it stuck fast between two pines. All it could do was throw open its jaws and bellow in impotent rage, and as it did so, Butcher sprang up and flung his spear down its throat. A piercing shriek tore through the night. A horrible gurgling swallowed it up, but not before it set the hair of Wren's nape on end. The boar reared and with a thunderous crash succeeded too late in wrenching itself out of the trees. The stag likewise reared at the sound. Wren seized it by the antlers to keep himself mounted. It snorted and dug its hooves into the dried needles, but settled within the moment. By then, Butcher had vanished again into the shadows of the forest. The boar, still not dead, and not even dying, Wren realized with growing horror, staggered backward into the riverbed, taking the makeshift spear with it. One of the pines toppled into the mud in the boar's wake. The broken tip of a tusk gleamed amidst the shattered wood. Beady black eyes rolled to whites Wren hadn't known the beast possessed. Blood, dark as ichor, dripped between tusks and the broken-off branch caught in the boar's throat. The howl of the hunting horn echoed through the forest, so faint at first Wren thought it was the wind, but growing louder with every passing moment and bringing with it the thundering of 100 hoofs. Whether it would arrive soon enough to finish off the boar, Wren knew not. All he knew was the familiar snap of Butcher breaking another dead branch and the silver flash of his dagger not 12 yards distant. With a gurgling bellow, the boar launched itself into the woods again, straight at where Wren had just espied Butcher. Wren's warning shout died in his throat as an arrow pierced the boar's eye. The boar reared, shrieking. The elf maiden astride a wolf dashed out of the forest and onto the riverbank. Her steed howled as she notched another arrow to her bow. A chorus of howls answered it. The thunderous approach of the hunt grew to a roar. The boar whirled toward each fresh noise as it arose, which meant it faced away from the elf maiden as she leapt off her steed and her wolf lunged for the boar's flank. The boar reeled to combat the wolf. More wolves burst forth from upstream. They surrounded the boar and leapt at it from all directions. One made it onto the boar's back, sinking its teeth into the hairy hump over the shoulders and ripping its head back and forth. Another made for the boar's underbelly, but a swift turn caught it on the tusks and catapulted it across the riverbed. It struck the rocks on the opposite bank with a sickening crunch like snapping branches and fell down to lie very still. The rest of the hunt surged in to take its place. The remaining wolves howled for blood and tore out the boar's flanks. Satyrs and centaurs hurled spears. The moth-like fairy with the fur ruff dove down on fluttering wings to inflict 1,000 nicks with its glass dagger. Arrow after arrow flew from the elf-maiden's bow and dozens of others. The boar gave as good as it got. One tusk-gored steed fell shrieking beneath its trotters, the rider in the spiderweb mask barely escaping the same fate. And the snow underfoot turned to crimson mud. Yet Wren couldn't focus on the chaos. His gaze kept flicking to the rim of the battlefield, the edge of the riverbank, the encircling tree line. The glint of moonlight off a blade's edge ignited a welcome spark of hope in his heart. Butcher leapt from the darkness as if born of shadow himself. In his fist he clenched a blade as slender as an icicle. He landed on the boar with all the agility and ferocity of a panther, bracing his limbs against its tusks as it shrieked and tossed its head. His blade found its sheath in the boar's remaining eye. A gout of blood accompanied the horrible guttural scream that burst from the boar's throat. A terrible shudder ran through its bulk. Then it collapsed. Butcher rode it to the ground, alighting only when it lay still. Cheers rang out from all corners as the hunt burst into jubilation at their victory. The wild rejoicing, mounts rearing, hunters leaping and whooping around the fallen boar, dancers springing up to merry songs, tripping off fey tongues, hid Butcher from Wren's sight. More by instinct than design, Wren slipped from the stag's back and staggered out of the forest to the edge of the riverbed to peer down the embankment. At first he could glimpse nothing of Butcher amidst the confusing tumult. Then a tall, dark figure strode forth from the fray. Strong hands held a delicate blade and wiped blood from silver on the tunic's hem. Glinting eyes gazed not down on the hand's work, but upward, searching the tree line with an intensity that quickened Wren's pulse. His heart hammered harder still when those dark eyes met his own and gleamed with unmistakable elation. Butcher sheathed his blade and climbed the embankment in 3 long strides. "Well done!" Wren blurted as Butcher joined him. The words hardly felt adequate to describe the courage and skill Butcher had displayed. Yet Butcher grinned down at him all the same. Wren noted his canines appeared more prominent than those of most mortal men. The pointed ears likewise drew his gaze again, if only for a moment before his interest came to what felt like its natural rest in Butcher's dark eyes, focused so intently on his own face. Wild impulses ran through Wren's mind. His fingers twitched with the repressed urge to seize those well-muscled shoulders in his hands. He bit his lip to quell the desire to take further liberties no decent gentleman would consider. As Butcher searched his face, his grin fading into a no less appreciative smile, Wren found he couldn't turn his mind from foolish thoughts without turning his head as well, and so glanced away from Butcher and toward the hunt. The rejoicing had only increased in the interim. Yet now, as Wren looked past the crowd around the fallen boar, he saw other figures in a more solemn gathering by the opposite bank. Some half-dozen wolves and werewolves attended to the crumpled form tossed by the boar scant minutes earlier. One of the werewolves knelt beside the wounded wolf and cradled its head in its lap. Its sides heaved with laboured breaths. Wren, astonished it still breathed at all, felt his heart wrench in his chest at the sight. "I know you said not to offer anything, but—" Wren dared to meet Butcher's gaze again. "Is there nothing to be done?" Butcher studied Wren's face with an expression Wren couldn't quite read. "We may approach." His words came low and gentle, rumbling forth from deep in his chest and resonating with the thrumming of Wren's own heart. Wren nodded his assent. Butcher led him across the riverbed to where the wolves had gathered around their fallen packmate. Several turned at their arrival. One pinned its ears back and snarled. Another, a werewolf, didn't look much friendlier, standing a full head taller than Butcher, with its arms crossed over its barreled chest as it blocked their path. Butcher halted a half-step ahead of Wren, and held one arm out between Wren and the wolves. "Your pardon, Butcher began, then continued in a language Wren didn't recognize, its words and tone both guttural and lyrical. The werewolf cocked its head to one side as it listened. When Butcher had finished, it replied in a deeper and more growling version of the same tongue. Butcher bowed. The werewolf nodded and made as if to turn away. Wren put a hand on Butcher's arm. The other went to his own throat and tore his cravat from his collar. "If they need a bandage," he explained, as he shoved it into bewildered Butcher's palm. "Or a sling, or something." For a moment Wren thought Butcher would refuse to pass it along. It certainly violated the rule against offerings. But then his fist closed over the cravat, and he turned to catch the werewolf's attention again. A much shorter conversation in the same unrecognizable language ensued. At first the werewolf appeared irritated at the interruption, insomuch as Wren could read any expression in the canine face. Then, in slow increments, its flattened ears perked up. Its lips relaxed their snarl, and at last it uncrossed its brawny arms to take the cravat from Butcher's outstretched palm. It nodded to Butcher and to Wren as well, and returned to its pack. Butcher caught Wren's eye and jerked his head toward the tree line across the riverbank. Wren followed him away. "She says thanks," Butcher murmured before Wren could ask. Wren stopped himself from questioning the pronoun. He knew little enough of human women. He could hardly expect to know a she-wolf on first sight, though now he knew better than to assume. "You needn't fear for them," Butcher continued. "Wolves heal up almost as quick as fey." A yelp came from behind them. Wren turned to see the wounded wolf staggering to its feet, supported by its fellows on either side, with more of its packmates leaping and yipping in victory. Its breath came hard and its lumbering limp bore little resemblance to its once fleet pace, but it lived. A scarlet band had wrapped around its midsection in the meantime. It took Wren a second glance to recognize his own formerly white cravat. Cracks and crackling filled the air. Broken branches had piled around the boar, several of them on fire thanks to the efforts of a few industrious armoured fey, still striking their chainmail and swords with flint. Other more impish fellows perched on the corpse, as if in imitation of the flock of ravens that had descended to begin their feast. The moth-like fairy in the mottled grey cloak seemed to delight in flitting through the embers, flying up to join the stars. The elf-maiden looked on from the fringe of the festivities with her bow held loose at her side, as a mortal girl might hold a doll. She took note of Wren and Butcher as they passed by, and inclined her head as if to invite them to join. Butcher shook his head in reply. She shrugged and turned away toward the other revellers. Beyond the boar, in a secluded curve of the riverbank, Wren espied the fairy in the spiderweb mask. A crimson stain had seeped through his seafoam green waistcoat and spread all down his side. It didn't seem to concern him overmuch as he daubed at the darkest parts with a lace-edged silk handkerchief. The stag awaited them at the forest's edge. Butcher swung himself up onto its back in the same swift leap as he'd done in Hyde Park. He held out his palm to Wren. His eyes danced with the gleam of the 100,000 stars above. A shy smile tugged at the corner of his handsome mouth. Wren's heart flung itself against his rib cage in its eagerness to join him. He settled for grasping that sinewy forearm and letting Butcher haul him up to sit beside him. His arms twined around Butcher's waist, as naturally as ivy climbing the oak. The crest of his hip bones jutted against the meat of Butcher's backside. His chin rested against the corded muscles of Butcher's shoulder. The exertion of the hunt had sharpened Butcher's scent, the wood smoke musk rising above vanilla notes to mingle with the salt sweat of valiant feats. Neither absinthe nor opium could prove more intoxicating to Wren's senses than this. Something stirred within his atrophied heart. Ancient embers breathed into renewed life by the exhilaration of the hunt and by Butcher's warm bulk in his arms. Something stirred lower down as well. Wren tried to turn his mind to less tempting thoughts. The immediacy of Butcher's body against his own condemned such ventures to failure. He settled for hoping Butcher wouldn't notice his growing interest. Then the thighs that overlapped Wren's own clenched against the stag's flanks, and they leapt forward into the night.
This has been the 5th chapter of the Oak King, Holly King audiobook, narrated by Gary Furlong. If you enjoyed what you heard today, you can find the full audiobook on Audible, Libro.fm, or quite possibly your local library through Libby or Hoopla. We'll be back next week with more Right Here, Right Queer. Until then, thank you for listening.